Now this is his paper that's so celebrated, and it's entitled, look at this, "Why Indeed Did the WTC Buildings Completely Collapse?" Now the first point I'd make about that title is, but the buildings didn't collapse. That's what the government has told us, but we know the buildings did not collapse. So why is that word collapse in the title? I actually had him on a radio talk show I was doing. I've done various since I retired here. It's like I'm busier now than I was when I was teaching full time. And I explained to Steve, surely we shouldn't use that word collapse. And he sheepishly admitted, yeah, you're right. We should use pulverize. So here's the title of his paper. Why did the WTC buildings completely collapse? Well, they didn't. That's the government's claim. That's not his, or shouldn't be. Then he says WTC buildings. His paper is strictly about the Twin Towers. So there's going to be this conference next weekend in Phoenix. And the guy who's running the conference would very much like to bring about some kind of unity among Steve and me. So he's got this session entitled Scholars Unity, right? And Steve was very hesitant to use that. And I said, well, if we're going to do this, then let's talk about, have two sessions, one about our agreement, which are all the reasons how we can prove the government's account is wrong, and then another on our disagreement. I said, as far as the disagreement, Steve's doing new work on Building 7. Well, I just, we have these, we've been fortunate lately, we talk about from the sublime to the ridiculous. In the March issue of Hustler, we have 4 pages on 9/11, 2 pages on politics, 2 pages on the science. And at the same time, we have in the 5th of February issue of The Nation magazine 7 letters to the editor about 9/11, including a lengthy one from me where I'm laying out like 24 disproofs of the government's account. So I said, well, look, for the first session on our agreement, I'll talk about the 24 reasons, and Steve can talk about his new work on Building 7, because we all agree. Building 7 is a huge smoking gun. And then during the second, Steve can talk about what happened to the Twin Towers, and I'll talk about what happened to the World Trade Center. Because the whole point of the research that Judy and Morgan have been doing, and why I've been so enthusiastic about it, is expanding our understanding of what it is we have to explain, which is known technically as the explanandum. They're showing us you can't just talk about the towers and claim to have explained what happened at the World Trade Center. Now there's a big difference between explaining the Twin Towers, or even the Twin Towers in Building 7, which is a special case, and explain what happened at the World Trade Center, because you got Building 3, 4, 5, and 6. So why does he say, why did the WTC buildings completely collapse? I said, let's have a session then where Steve talks about what happened on the Twin Towers, and I talk about what happened at the World Trade Center, and it become immediately obvious why I don't believe any longer that thermate is adequate, and why we have to look at more exotic, if you want, forms of demolition. But if we want to explain it, we're going to have to be faithful and be able to explain what actually happened. And I see it as about a 0 probability for these effects given thermite and thermate. And then he says in here, in his abstract, I call for a serious investigation of the hypothesis that WTC-7 and the Twin Towers were brought down not just by impact damage and fires, but through the use of pre-positioned cutter charges. Well, look how prematurely that narrows the issue. If you can't have a reinvestigation, let's say, by some modes of controlled demolition other than gravitational collapse and fires brought about by the jet plane impacts, okay? You don't say pre-positioned cutter charges. That implies that if you disprove that it wasn't done by pre-positioned cutter charges, or pre-positioned cutter charges couldn't be enough, then you've basically vindicated the government and shown that what he's called for has been satisfied. Now there's no reason to go anywhere else. So this has troubled me. Now that's not all that's troubled me. Some of the evidence that Steve has cited in support of his hypothesis is the thermite-thermate hypothesis. I would like for him to consider further. Here's one. This is a building, this is the South Tower around the 80th floor where the plane hit. And you get this stream of something, but Steve has claimed is thermite. Now notice the location there. It's the 3rd notch over, right, from the left. 3rd notch over. Well, but looky here. All of a sudden now it's the 4th notch over. Now, I'll grant you that these photographs appear not to have been taken at the same time, but it's very interesting that here you find it in the 3rd notch, here you find it in the 4th. Not only that, but there's some evidence that thermate may have been used to clean up ground zero. I mean, here's some indications that thermate may have been used to clean up ground zero. In addition, remember all these weird effects, right? These incisions, these laser-like incisions in the damage. I mean, here, how many can you count here? I mean, just try counting them. How many weird things do you find in this one photograph alone? I think Judy told me a student of hers had undertaken a count, found like 50 different holes in the World Trade Center that look as though they had to be done from above and are very surgical in their character. Well, how can thermate explain that? And here, this is very interesting. This is in Building 6. Remember the one where I said it was like it took the kidney out? These are workmen going down into Building 6. Now, just bear in mind, according to the evidence that Steve places greatest emphasis on, there are these massive pools of molten metal underneath the World Trade Center. Well, if there are massive pools of molten metal under the World Trade Center, what are these pools of standing water doing there? You couldn't have those pools of standing water. You couldn't have these guys down there walking around if there are these massive pools of molten metal. So that's part of why, you know, I've said to you that she suggests, see that kind of smoke in the air? She's suggesting that's residue from molecular dissociation, and you need to have some plausible story to discount it, otherwise you got to explain it. This is Building 4, and it used to have an extension out to the left that was very substantial, and it's like it's just been cut off. Here's another view of it. And see again, you got all that residue in the air that might or might not be smoke, but which may, you know, which is why I think they came up with the massive pools of molten metal hypothesis. And here's Building 4 again. You can almost see the outline of where that extension of the building was attached. Now here we can all agree. This, a pancake collapse, did not occur at the World Trade Center. Rather, something spectacular, completely unexpected, took us by surprise. If our research is well-founded, then we're forced to the conclusion that the American government has been using violence and threats of violence to instill fear into the American people, to manipulate us for political purposes, especially to launch illegal wars in violation of international law, the UN Charter, even the US Constitution. George Bush claims to have studied American history and discovered that the great presidents were the war presidents. He wanted to be a war president. Project for the New American Century, this neoconservative think tank had come up with a master plan for world domination, creating a string of bases around the world, including an aggressive intervention in the Middle East, taking control of natural resources and exerting American military power out from that geopolitically sensitive area. And this appears to be the ultimate foundation for what has been going on, complemented by the fact that massive military-industrial entities like Halliburton, which of course you all know Dick Cheney used to run, have been picking up these $100 billion no-bid contracts for feeding our troops garbage in Iraq. And now, of course, the president's playing word games, claiming we're not going to invade Iran and we're not going to go to war with Iran, and yet they're contemplating a military bombing operation against Iran, mark my words, which could occur as early as tonight, because it's related to the phases of the moon. And I'll just tell you, if our research is correct, then, and the government has been using acts of violence and fear of acts, threats of acts of violence to instill fear into us, including a whole bunch of superficial, meaningless forms of security imposed at airports, so that every time you go through an airport, you're reminded of how scary this world is supposed to be. That's a classic definition of terrorism, and what that means, my friends, I'm sorry to say, is the American government has been practicing terrorism on the American people.
Yes.
Amen.
Thank you.